Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Spotlight on Food Producers, Measuring Progress Towards Net Zero Emissions. As it says on the slide, this is a webinar organized by the Transition Pathway Initiative, TPI Centre, which is part of the Grantham Institute of Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. My name's David Russell. I'm chair of the board of the TPI Limited, which is the asset owner-led organisation behind the Transition Pathway Initiative, of which the TPI Centre is our research partner. The TPI is an asset owner-led organisation supported by asset managers and asset owners from around the world. It was launched in 2017 to provide asset owners and asset managers with the information they need to understand how companies are going to transition to net zero, to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and get to the emissions we need by 2050. From those early days, it's expanded to have 150 plus 151 actually supporters from around the world, asset owners and asset managers, representing around $60 trillion in assets. This is the fifth webinar that we've done in recent months, focusing on the carbon, and this one obviously focused on the methodology and the outputs of assessing how the carbon emissions of the food processing sector, food producing sector is going. This is the 11th of such sector focus that the TPI Centre has done, with a strong focus on the high emitting, the energy carbon intensive sectors. We're going to present the results today. This is the first exposure of those results, and they'll be published on the TPI's website next week. And the assessment will cover the first 26 companies in that sector. Can we move to the next slide, please? Today's agenda on the screen, I'll run through very quickly. First of all, I'm going to pass over to Simon Dietz, who is the Professor of Environmental Policy at the LSE, and he's the technical lead, the research director for the TPI Centre, and has been working with the TPI for 5, 6, 7 years. And Simon can give you more details on that and the workings of the TPI Centre, and also the rationale behind the methodology that we're going to be talking about today. He's going to be followed by Valentin Yan, a principal research project manager at the TPI Centre, who'll run through the methodology, and Chris Budnovich Portalis, who will provide the overview of the results before they're published next week. And we'll then move on to actually some users of the data, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, but feel free to put questions into the question box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. This session's being recorded and will be available on the TPI Transition Pathway Initiative.org website in the coming days. Also on the website, you'll find the methodology document currently on the food sector. Also, the results will come out next week, but there's also a range of other TPI research on carbon transition available on the website. With that, I'll hand over to Simon Dietz.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. So yes, Simon Dietz here. As David said, I'm the research director of the TPI Centre, and I'm just going to provide you with a little bit of further background context about the centre, and then some remarks about the food sector and about how we assess the carbon performance of large corporations. Next slide, please. So as David mentioned, the TPI Centre is a research centre based in the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, which itself is part of the London School of Economics. We're a research centre that serves as an independent, authoritative source of research and data on the progress that corporates and sovereign entities are making in the low carbon transition. We aim to develop rigorous and transparent methodologies to assess and monitor entities' climate actions, their transition pathways, and alignment with net zero. We're committed to providing our data free and open access on our online tool, And we also align our methodologies with existing reporting frameworks. And again, as David mentioned, we are the research partner of TPI, which itself is an asset owner-led initiative supported by asset managers and service providers. Next slide, please. This slide provides you with an overview of the data that we currently offer. We have over 1,000 publicly listed companies in our online tool on which we assess their so-called management quality. That is an assessment of companies' governance and management of carbon emissions and the risks and opportunities presented by the low carbon transition. And those companies are clustered in 18 different economic sectors. For about 400 of those companies, we also provide an assessment of their so-called carbon performance. And I'll say a little bit more in a moment about what carbon performance is. We also work with the Climate Action 100 Plus or CA 100 Plus initiative to develop disclosure frameworks and provide net zero benchmark assessments for the 150 companies that are of focus for Climate Action 100 Plus. Fourthly, we have a bespoke assessment framework for the banking sector, which we've developed with IIGCC series and others, and we currently assess 26 big banks on that framework. And lastly, we now have a data tool covering sovereign bond issuers through the so-called ASCOR project, and there are 25 countries in that data tool as of now. And we are expanding all the time, both in terms of the number of companies we cover and in terms of the number of different asset classes for which we provide assessments. Next slide, please. Now, let me move on to the topic of today, which is the food sector. So really just a bit of general background here, and I'm sure that none of this will be surprising to our audience. Agriculture and the food system are evidently major drivers of environmental degradation. Agriculture is linked to 90% of global deforestation and 85% of species at risk of extinction. At the same time, agriculture heavily depends on the natural environment for the resources it uses to produce the food that we eat. Specifically in relation to climate change, the food system has been estimated to account for about 33% of greenhouse gas emissions globally today, within a range of uncertainty. And based on current trends and stated policies relating to the food system, that share of emissions is not predicted to fall as we get to mid-century. Okay. Therefore, we need a transformation of the food system going forward, decarbonisation of the global food system, if we're going to meet international climate goals. Next slide, please. Now, as TPI focuses on publicly listed companies, the object of interest in this study, our target, is publicly listed food producer companies. And from the perspective of food producers, the key issue is that most of their carbon footprint is upstream in the value chain related to agriculture, land use change, and forestry. That accounts for more than 4/5 of the life cycle carbon footprint of the food sector. The remaining 18% is middle and downstream in things like transportation, packaging, food processing and retail, and is primarily associated with energy use. On the right of the slide, you can see how upstream agricultural emissions break down into different areas. So for us, in constructing carbon performance measures for food producers, the key challenge here is going to be able to somehow account for upstream agricultural emissions, which from the perspective of food producers will be reported under Scope 3, Category 1, purchased goods and services. Next slide, please. So my last slide is just to give you a general overview of what we do when we assess corporates' carbon performance. So the idea behind carbon performance is to evaluate whether a company's current and planned future emissions are aligned with international climate goals. So you can think about this as a Paris alignment test, and I think that language has become quite widespread in research and in the industry. And if you're going to construct a Paris alignment test, then that basically involves doing two things. The first thing you need to do is create a set of low carbon benchmark scenarios against which you're going to compare companies. And the key thing is that we do this on a sectoral basis using the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So recognizing that different sectors face different challenges in decarbonising, we produce different low carbon benchmarks for each sector. Once we've got those benchmarks in place, the second part of the task is to overlay the company data on that. And we do that by constructing companies' historical emissions and future targeted emissions using information publicly disclosed by the companies. And the result of the analysis typically looks like what you can see here on the left of the slide. You have the benchmark scenarios in different shades of blue, and then over the top of that, you've got overlaid 3 hypothetical companies, imaginatively named A, B, and C, which are aligned to different degrees with the benchmarks. So that is what we're trying to do in this report, in this presentation today. But the challenge is going to be, how do you make this work in the food sector? Because the food sector has typically not been part of attempts to assess the Paris alignment of companies to this point. So to explain to you how we've tackled this task, I'm going to now hand over to my TPI Centre colleague, Valentin Jan. Valentin, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Simon, for that great introduction. So as Simon mentioned, the question now becomes, how do you, how do you take all of that information and turn it into a methodology that you can then use to determine the Paris alignment of the pathway of various food producing companies? So in my section, I just want to outlay some of the key challenges that are particular to the food sector. That we haven't had in other sectors, and that also influence just the time to develop this kind of framework. I'm then going to walk you through the methodology and how we solve those challenges, present you the final pathways that we've developed, and then also quickly talk a little bit about how we assess companies themselves before then handing over to Cristobal, who's going to talk you through the results using that methodology. So if we move to the next slide. Yeah, so here I just want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we face in the food sector relative to some of the other sectors that we've assessed, like, for example, the steel sector. And also just to say that it's also quite exciting to present this now, because this has been one of the most challenging sectors that we have tackled from a methodological perspective. So in the food sector, you just have to recognize that the realities on the ground are very complex. So you have a lot of small producers, some large producers, but just the overall number of producers is very large of agricultural products. You have a huge amount of different products. If you think about it from a food producer perspective, lots and different ingredients. These ingredients can be produced using a huge amount of different agricultural practices that will also vary by region and climate. And all of that then also translates into different disclosure requirements across different regions. The disclosures, of course, being the basis of and the information that we use for our assessments, and where we have to make sure that the disclosures that we typically find are consistent with the benchmarks that we have produced. So from this first point, I just want to point out the choice of assessing food producers as opposed to, for example, agricultural companies, is that at the food producer level, you have a huge amount of concentration, both in terms of agricultural inputs, but also in terms of market cap. So that defined our choice to really focus on that part of the value chain. Secondly, we have the fact that as opposed to the other sectors that we have covered so far, we don't have a scenario from the International Energy Agency that we can use to project the emissions and the production of the food system going forward in a low carbon scenario. Particularly what is difficult when it comes to projecting the emissions from the agricultural sector is the emissions from land use and land use change in forestry, so LULUC in short. And that was a real challenge for us to figure out as well. And I'm going to talk about a bit more how we did that in the next slide. And then lastly, just you're faced on one hand with the huge amount of complexity and different disclosures from companies, and on the other hand, there's a relative lack of scenario data. So it was a real challenge to state all of that on a consistent basis so that whatever pathway you calculate as a benchmark has the same system boundaries, has the same uses the same weight metrics, etc., as the information you can typically find on a company level. So just to give you one example, if you're a food producer, the weight of and therefore the normalization measure of the inputs is going to be very different from the weight of your outputs, because you will potentially get rid of quite a lot of the weight by only using parts of the inputs, or you're going to add water, etc. So just to give you an example of the level of data matching that we had to kind of accommodate in this methodology. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, so please don't be intimidated, but essentially I just want to walk through what we did to address those issues, why we did that, and then lastly, how we did that. So what did we do? Fundamentally, the approach that we've chosen is to calculate a base year emissions intensity that is stated on a system boundary that is consistent with the disclosures that we can typically expect to find from companies. So that was the first step. And then in a second step, we estimate the reduction rates that can be expected in low carbon scenarios. So 1.5 degrees, below 2 degrees, and 2 degrees based on IPCC scenarios. Why did we do that? The key here really is what I mentioned earlier about making sure that whatever boundary you choose for the benchmark is consistent with the type of information you can find on a company level. So, for example, if you think about the weight issue, you want to be sure that the metric that is used for the benchmark is stated on this at exactly the same point in the system as the information in terms of weight that you find from the companies. And that is information you typically don't find in a consistent way in IPCC databases. For example, IPCC databases will include feed, which is fed to cattle, etc. So it will include tobacco and cotton, non-food products. So you really want to make sure everything is consistent. But of course we can't undertake our own, system modeling here, food system modeling into the future. So for the reduction rates, we do rely on the IPCC scenarios that, broadly speaking, in terms of their reduction rate, do provide a really good picture of what you should expect from the food sector in terms of alignment with Paris. So just lastly, if we look at how did we do that, Chris, if we can just give it one quick click. So on the one hand, in the first step, we look at the global agricultural production data by commodity from the FAO, and we do quite a lot of work on that database, which is huge, to only stick with commodities that are used for human consumption directly. So, for example, we strip out tobacco and cotton, and we also use another database to determine the share of, let's say, wheat that is being used for human consumption, which is used for feed, and which is also used as seeds for the next harvest. So that is the first step. Secondly, we then apply emissions factors that we've collected largely from poor NEMESEC, which is a standard work in the area. but complemented by other sources. And the key aspect here is that for every emissions factor that we use, we make sure that we use the same system boundary, so everything is consistent. So that gives us the base year emissions intensity. From step A, we get the weight, and from step B, we get the emissions. In the second step, we then project this forward. Chris, if you can just, yes, by going into the IPCC AR6 database, we select 3 different models, image, message globium, and remind magpie, because they have the most sophisticated land use modules, and they also have scenarios for both 1.5 degrees, below 2 degrees, and 2 degrees, to project forward the agricultural emissions. And then we also use IEA scenarios for energy use in food processing to determine the pathway for scope 1 and 2 emissions for food producers. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what that looks like. So in terms of absolute emissions, we calculate roughly 13.8 gigatons of CO2e in 2020, which is very consistent with other estimates that we found, which also provides us with a very nice robustness test. And we estimate around 5 billion tons of agricultural inputs, which gives us roughly 2.7 tons of CO2 per ton per ton of agricultural inputs in 2020. And we then apply, as mentioned earlier, the reduction rates from the IPCC scenarios for scope 3, which is the vast majority, and then from IEA scenarios for scope 1 and 2, so energy-related emissions from food producing. One thing to just point out here, you may be surprised that the emissions don't reach 0 in 2050, and that is not related to CO2. CO2 in the sector does go negative, actually, but this is largely related to methane, which remains positive until 2050 and also beyond. If we go to the next slide, I just want to really quickly focus on the company level before handing over to Chris. So here you can see the measure that we use for on the company side. The company's intensity in a given year is calculated as a scope 1, 2, and 3 category 1 purchased agricultural inputs divided by the weight of the sourced agricultural inputs. So just one side note here, if a company does provide specifically the emissions just from agriculture inputs, we will use that over the more broader category 1 purchase goods and services category. And then lastly, to just give you an intuition for the heterogeneity of the different agricultural products that you might expect, you can see here that, beef and dark chocolate just being, a lot more carbon intensive than a lot of the other products. Some products actually almost, have a positive effect, like nuts, because of the positive land use impacts of nut agriculture. And the other thing I wanted to point out here is also, you can really see the vast majority of the emissions of almost any of these products is associated with land use change, with farming, or with animal feed. So from a food producer point of view, the upstream emissions from sourced agricultural inputs are the most material. So with that, I hope you have enough background on the methodology and are excited to hear from Cristobal about the results when applying this. So handing over to you, Chris.
Yes, thanks, Valentin, for your presentation on the food producers' carbon performance methodology to set the ground of the results that I'm about to present. To start with, I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to be here today to share and discuss the result of this collaborative effort, which represents months of dedicated work by the TPI Center research team. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the companies assessed during the 2023 cycle. As it was previously said, we selected the 26 largest publicly listed food producers to optimize sector coverage within the scope of this study. The first thing to remark is that the 26 assessed companies totaled a combined free float market capitalization of nearly 930 United States dollars in 2022, and that represents over 75% of the total market capitalization of the sector. On the bottom left hand side of the slide, you can see some selected companies, which include Kraft Heinz from the US, Nestle, which is headquartered in Switzerland, and Kikkoman, which is headquartered in Japan. Well, the companies that we assess are geographically concentrated in the US, Europe, and Asia. We see that many of these companies operate globally. Then on the right-hand side, you can see a pie chart illustrating the distribution of market capitalization among these food producers. And the main message here is that the 6 largest food producers concentrate around 2/3 of the total market capitalizations of the assessed companies. Then there are 3 key highlights that I will deep dive into, and I want you to take away after my presentation, and these are that firstly, and notably, we found that most food producers have set at least one GHG emission reduction target. And secondly, food producers demonstrated a low level of alignment with our 1.5 degree benchmark, which was previously presented by Valentin. And thirdly, that the limited company disclosure across the sector stands out as a main issue in assessing most companies' decarbonization efforts. Let's get into the first stated highlight. To give you an overview of the number of targets that we could potentially assess, we mapped all the emissions reduction targets set by the food producers across the 3 different timeframes that we assess. And the bar chart on the left-hand side shows mainly 2 things. Firstly, on the one hand, for the short term, we see that there is a trend of an absence of targets, with 22 companies not setting any short-term goal, and that's represented by the dark gray area in the bottom lower part of the slide on the bar. And then on the other hand, for the medium and long term, a more positive trend appears with 22 and 16 companies, which represents 85 and 60% of our assessed sample, set at least one greenhouse gas emission reduction target. And that's represented by the light gray and blue bar area of the medium and right bar. However, we just can only assess 5 of the company's medium-term targets and 3 of these long-term targets, respectively. And this can be explained by 2 main factors. Linking to the point 3, when companies' historical emissions intensities cannot be calculated due to this lack of disclosure, the future emissions intensities implied by these targets cannot be measured either. And that's because we don't have a baseline against which to apply these stated targets. That means that some targets that we could potentially assess if we are provided the right information are not included in companies' carbon performance assessment. Another issue that we often found is that some companies may set targets on a basis that is inconsistent with our methodology. An example of this could be that a company may set a target on a group-wide basis rather than stating how it will specifically apply to their food-producing business. Let's move on into the second highlight, and to provide an overview of how these map targets shown in the previous slides look in practice, we plot on the left-hand side of the graph the emissions intensity pathway against the benchmark that was described by Valentin previously. And two insights emerge from this slide on the left-hand side, and those are that companies face different challenges in aligning with international climate goals, and that's represented by the emissions intensity starting points. Two factors that might explain this difference in starting points can be either the input mix or their efficiency of their manufacturing plants. As previously Valentin showed, different commodities have different embodied emissions intensity, and that can be a big driver of their emissions intensity. Another thing to remark is that relative to the pilot cycle, we were able to assess an extra 6 companies, which shed light on where the sector is going in terms of disclosure. As in the pilot cycle, which was approximately 1 year ago, we were only able to assess properly one company, and it shows that the sector is moving forward. Then on the right-hand side, we have a summary of the company alignments with the TPI benchmark by time frame. Here, the first thing to remark is that no company aligns with the 1.5 degree benchmark across the 3 time frames. Only Nestlé and Ajinomoto align with the 1.5 degree benchmark. Nestlé in the medium and long term, whereas Ajinomoto only in the long term. Similarly, Nestlé aligns with the below 2 degree benchmark in the short term, whereas Mowi aligns in the medium term and long term with that same benchmark scenario. Let's now move on to the third highlight that I want to deep dive on. And in this slide, we just want to highlight how food producers compare to the other 10 high emitting sectors in terms of 2050 alignment. And basically, we have 2 key findings. Firstly, we see that food producers' share of known and suitable disclosure is the largest by a wide margin. 73% of the assessed food producers have a known and suitable disclosure, compared to the following sector, which is cement, that has almost 50%. And that's represented by the gray area on the bars on the bottom part of the graph. The second point that I want to make in this slide is that food producers also have the lowest proportion of companies aligned with the 1.5 degree benchmark in 2050, with 8% of the assessed sample. And that's followed by another quite difficult sector to decarbonize, which is oil and gas, that has 12% of their companies aligned with 1.5 based on our assessments in 2050. These figures can be partly attributed to the fact that for food producing companies, there is a relatively high data requirement compared to other sectors, and I will address these data requirements in the next slide. Now, as I said, let's talk about the third highlight. And in this slide, linking to point one, on why we cannot assess most of the stated targets, we basically deep dive into the specific disclosure issues impacting the food producing sector in the 2023 assessment cycle. The bar chart on the left-hand side illustrates which of the required metrics are effectively disclosed by companies for a carbon performance assessment. And firstly and positively, almost 80% of the companies disclose scope 3 category 1 emissions. However, there is a significant gap in the disclosure of source agricultural inputs in units of mass, as only 10 companies, which represents less than 40% of our sample disclose this metric. And this is the primary reason for the high share of companies with no or unsuitable disclosure in the 2023 assessment cycle. Then on the right-hand side of the graph, we see that only 7 companies explicitly mention agricultural and LULUC emissions that were effectively reported in their disclosures. Then on the right-hand side of the slide, we'll list 2 desirable metrics that allows us for a more accurate calculation and deeper analysis. And these are companies disclosing scope 3 category 1 emissions on specifically purchased agricultural inputs. And secondly, companies disclosing source agricultural inputs by type of commodity. But only a few companies reveal this information, as 5 disclose the first desirable metric and 4 the second one. Now, as recommendation, as a next step, we have seen throughout this presentation that assessing the carbon performance of food producers is complex and requires relatively detailed data on emissions and activity. And we believe that investors can play a crucial role in overcoming the current lack of disclosure through the engagement with food producing companies. In fact, we observe that existing reporting practices from some of the assessed companies suggest that data collection and reporting on this metric is feasible, as we see that many of the companies that we cannot assess disclose data on the share of responsibly sourced commodity, which might indicate that they gather that information. Lastly, going forward, the TPI Center remains committed to conducting annual carbon performance assessment of food producer, and we aim to progressively expand the sector coverage, and we are targeting over 90% of the market capitalization in the subsequent cycles. I'll just leave this here as a summary of the key takeaways from the results, and I'll hand it over back to David, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Valentin, for running through the methodology. Just so that you're aware, the link to the report has been, the methodology has been put into the chat if you want to go there. Also, the link to the TPI's website. We're now going to, I'm sorry, and there are some questions coming in, so keep those coming in. We've had 5 so far. There's one that's already been answered. We're now going to move on. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next one. We're now going to move on to the perspective of some users, and over to you, Jon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David. I'm Jon Wisnowski, and I'm a senior research analyst at Planet Tracker, where I lead our efforts in assessing the climate transition strategies of individual companies. And for those of you that are not familiar with Planet Tracker yet, we are a financial think tank, part of the Tracker Group, together with our sister company, Carbon Tracker. And while Carbon Tracker tackles hard-to-abate sectors with a focus on climate, Planet Tracker was created with the ambition of covering those sectors with a higher impact on nature, and we do so by leveraging the power of financial institutions in changing companies and sectors as a whole towards more sustainable practices. Still, because we are a non-for-profit, it means that the development of our projects is in line with our funders' requests, which brings us back to my focused area, which is climate transition. And for context, we started this specific work stream a couple of years ago by analyzing the climate transition plans of consumer goods companies from the CA100 list. And I'm saying this because our initiative overlaps with TPI's work, as we both assess giants like Danone and Nestlé, although at different points in time and, of course, using a slightly different methodology. Still, this overlap caught our attention and in fact made us look deeper into TPI's approach. And I want to say, for starters, at Planet Tracker, we firmly believe that climate and nature go hand in hand. In other words, you cannot have a climate transition without addressing nature. And this view we discovered aligns with TPI's new methodology for assessing food producers, as their approach highlights the link between climate and nature as well. And in our opinion, TPI's methodology stands out and in fact brings value to the industry for two main reasons. And the first being employing sectoral decarbonization approach, which is setting a sector-specific benchmark based on the global greenhouse gas targets. And thus, this allows for a nuanced assessment that takes into account the different challenges and opportunities for emission reductions across different sectors. And the second point is that it assesses emissions intensity by normalizing the sectoral emissions against a measure of activity like production, like physical production, which in turn is linked to the economic activity of these food producers, and provides a clear example there of emissions intensity. And we find this to be a crucial step for grasping the environmental impact of food production in relationship with its output volume. And at the same time highlights the food sector's significant role in both contributing to, but also being impacted by climate change. Also, their methodology advocates for supply side mitigation strategy when it comes to efficient land use and livestock management, and also demand side strategies like shifts towards more plant-based diets, which again we consider is crucial as these strategies are in fact essential for our planet's conservation. But more specifically, by including the indirect emissions, especially the upstream scope 3 emissions in the assessment, I do consider that TPI's methodology indirectly assesses the food sector impact on land use, ecosystems, and to some degree biodiversity. And this inclusion is fundamental for understanding how climate transition strategy intersect with effects on natural habitats, especially since in our experience doing this type of analysis, and also as highlighted by Simon at the beginning, scope 3 activities contribute to a vast majority of these food producers' footprint. But, of course, this is an exercise that comes with these challenges, as also mentioned by Valentin and Cristobal, as many companies, despite disclosing scope 3, or at least a big majority disclose scope 3, not as many disclose the natural commodities they source, or that their sort of manufacturing process depends on. We at Planet Tracker believe that new regulation, of course, would aid in leveling the playing field in terms of disclosures, and I'm sure that TPI also shares this view. But I'm gonna wrap it up. In essence, the key takeaway that I would like everyone to take away today is that TPI's methodology in assessing the carbon performance of food production brings forward that link between climate transition efforts and nature conservation, and it does so through the sector-specific benchmark and a comprehensive emissions coverage, despite the lack of disclosures from some companies, but overall offers a holistic view of the food sector role in environmental sustainability. And going forward, to give you a bit of sort of preview, Planet Tracker is going to center in analyzing the climate transition plans of chemical companies of the C100 list over the next 2 years. And of course, we would be pleased to see TPI's approach extending maybe to this segment as well. And we say that because the standardized approach that the framework follows not only makes comparing this corporation easier for investors, but also we believe it offers key insights to other organizations like ourselves on which we can continue to build on. So that's my view on TPI's work, and I'll take any questions at the end. Thank you.
think it's over to Simon now.
Okay, thanks,
The
David. Yes,
Q&A.
I wasn't sure whether we would just go directly to me, but yes, as David said, it's time for questions and answers. Somewhat remarkably, we're running slightly ahead of time. I can't remember when was the last time that happened, so there's plenty of time for questions. Just a reminder that if you would like to put a question to our speakers, please type it into the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar, and I will relay it to the speakers. So I can see 4 questions in the Q&A at the moment. They're all fairly technical questions about the analysis. I'm going to put a couple of them to you, Chris, first, and a couple of them to Valentin second. So, Chris, the first question I'd like to put to you is regarding the base year for the analysis. So this is from an anonymous attendee who writes, 2020 was quite an odd year, pandemic, also for food producers. Why did you take that year and not, for example, 2019 or 2021?
Sure. So we took 2020 as the latest year of the data that we used to develop the benchmarks, and that was provided by the sources that we use to develop them, namely the integrated assessment models and the IEA data that was used when the benchmarks were developed. And yeah, if you want to add something, Valentin, as the main author of the methodology, please go ahead or correct me.
Yeah, no, you're entirely correct. So there are 2 reasons. So we did calculate 2019, and we didn't in terms of intensity, rather than maybe the absolute values, we didn't find a huge difference. And then the way that the IPCC and other models usually work is that you have 5-year intervals or something like that. So we wanted to match the base year as closely as possible with the actual data point that we could get from the modeling community. So that's ultimately why we settled on 2020.
Thanks, gents. So one more question to you, Chris, if I may. So this is about the scope of emissions that we include in the analysis. So the question is, why do you limit scope 3 to upstream only? Downstream can be very material for the sector. I suppose this depends on which where your focus companies are located in the value chain, right?
Yes. As we saw throughout the presentation, when we divided the relevant emissions by value chain stage, we see that in the food sector, most of them are concentrated upstream, and also we see, or we stand at the middle of the value chain and took all the upstream emission, as there is a high concentration of market value and also emissions upstream. Do you want to add anything, Valentin, related to that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think it's something that can be it's something we considered using including emissions from waste. But this is something that that is just very, very complicated to do. So while it is material, we think that the current approach of focusing on the production captures the vast majority and the most important source, and also the key aspect where the food producers themselves can make a difference in terms of their sourcing choices, etc. They have less control over, how exactly their products are then being used and how they're being disposed, and the amount of emissions that are associated with that. But it is something that we did look into. We do recognize that it's material, but for the reason that it's very complicated, that it's not often modeled, that it's not in the emissions factors, and the fact that it's not entirely clear how that would affect the transition risk profile of a given company, or how they would even affect those emissions, ultimately led us to have this approach that we currently have that really focuses on the sourcing.
Okay, so I've got questions coming in now fairly thick and fast. So the two questions, Valentin, that I wanted to put to you are, firstly, they're both from anonymous attendee. So the first one is, do the benchmarks include land sequestration CDR? And the second question is, what's the rationale between TPI accepting offsets in the methodology?
Yeah, thanks for that. So on the CDR point, the models that we use don't include CDR as a technology, but they obviously include carbon dioxide removal in the form of afforestation and just general improvement of the land use system. So what we see, and that depends again then on the different scenarios that you use. So in the 1.5 degree scenarios, the net sequestration in terms of CO2 is usually more pronounced than in others. And there's also an important consideration here to be made regarding how the accounting works in the model and how the negative emissions, or the carbon dioxide removal from things like afforestation filter through to the industrial model of module of the model, or the energy module. So the short answer is that you do have negative emissions from afforestation. They're not necessarily, a CDR technology in a strict sense, but they do play a major role in the decarbonization of the sector. And that's also what you find, it's quite reasonable because, when we look at the companies that we assess, etc., afforestation is a key factor, and that's exactly, in a way, what you want. So you want to reverse the land use system to be a net emitter and turn it into a net sink, and in a way that if you use these benchmarks that include this effect, you're also essentially expecting that the players in the land use system will support this kind of mitigation option. Sorry, and then the second question, offsets. So the offsets really only exist sort of on the company level. So moving now from the benchmark to the company. So just talking about the emissions reductions or negative emissions that occur outside the company that you're assessing, that would be then purchased by the company, that would be considered an offset. We don't have a strict policy on offsets that has largely to do with the amount of disclosure that you can get on their use, etc. But also it has to do with the fact that in principle, offsetting is a cost-effective measure. The transition would be much more expensive without them. So what we really stress is, where they are being used, to be very careful. They're very risky. We do agree with that. We understand that the systems and the markets are not very well developed. Nonetheless, taking a strict approach would, require us to largely throw out most of the targets that we find, because most companies don't actually tell you whether or not they will use emissions reduction credits. And then the last point on that is, our methodology in terms of the historical emissions relies on scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures. Those don't usually include offsets. They usually, and under the greenhouse gas protocol, should be reported separately. So when we do track companies' progress on their transition, that does not include offsets.
Okay, it's exactly 3:30 local time. So I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And as we've mentioned, the methodology report is already out, and the results report and the data will be available from Monday. So have a good day, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.